getting there. Okay, so start recording, start streaming. Okay, I think we're ready to do this bad boy. So I want to make sure I'm recording on my end, you're recording on your end. I have everything going. Perfect. All right, let's do it. So you ready in 3, 2, no, sorry, my thing popped out. 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to the Indie Dev Podcast. I am your host, David Voiles. With me this week is Adam Peterson. Adam is a software engineer who spent much of his time building the N3S, an NES emulator which works on Microsoft's Hololens. Best of all, current games are displays of not only holographic images presented in world space, but are also 3D objects in the form of voxels. Although the project hasn't had an official release, you can still compile the source code and get a feel for it yourself if you have a HoloLens. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Hey Dave, how's it going? Happy to be on.
Very good. I'm extremely excited to have you on here as for a number of reasons. First of all, I love understanding how people are making games, specifically for older platforms like the NES, the Genesis, that era. I love understanding assembly or even C code. But also we have a mutual friend in Paul DiCarlo who arranged
Paul's
this.
Great.
So Paul's a coworker of mine, and we bonded immediately because, again, we both have a passion for old things. So when we got our HoloLenses a couple weeks ago, when we were at our training, our offsite for work, he showed me what you were working on and absolutely blew my mind. I thought, okay, we've got to tell the world about this. So why don't you give us a rundown on what this is that we're talking about, and then we'll go into how you got started with programming.
Great, sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to. So N3S, which was kind of named by a roommate and my best friend Cal, gave me. He said N3DS, and I'm like, oh, there already is a 3DS. He doesn't follow Nintendo stuff, so he didn't know. But the 3E pun I was into. So now we're sticking by that. It's N3S.
Okay.
It's actually for Windows mostly. The main port is for the desktop, even though HoloLens 1 is what's getting all this attention.
Right.
But basically, it's a 3D Nintendo emulator. What it does is it takes 2D games and currently is generating sort of 3D meshes automatically and renders those basically in place of any 2D graphics.
Okay.
So, and one thing, I guess, something that a lot of people didn't quite catch, and it's weird because it's all hypothetical still. I'm working on it now. So the first phase of that was to successfully emulate the Nintendo Picture Processing Unit, which is the old school name for a video card.
That's the PPU, right?
PPU, yep, for short. It sounds a little funny saying it that way. So, but it emulates the PPU, and the advantage to that isn't just, oh, I can render these sprites in 3D. It's I can actually render whatever I want in place of what the game is saying should go where.
Right.
So currently, I'm sort of not procedurally generating. That's not the right word. But I'm basically extruding these 2D graphics into these little voxel blocky shapes.
Okay.
But like the pipe, for example, if you look at the pipe in like the HoloLens video or the desktop recordings, isn't truly 3D. It's not round. It's not hollow in the middle. So the idea is to now, and this is the part I'm moving into now, is to build an editor into the program that lets you edit these things and save them as 3D models that are truly sort of hand-edited to look like it's actually in 3D.
Okay, so there's all kinds of little tricks of the trade that you're putting together here.
Yeah. So that's the reason I mention that is because it doesn't look super great yet, and people are like, it looks cool on HoloLens definitely, but the end game is to make these things like really 3D and actually curate all the best ones. So when you go to load your Mario Brothers ROM, automatically it just looks super awesome. So I think I saw you pulled some of that stuff up. So you see, it's just kind of. It's flat, it's all extruded, it's kind of weird, especially when you zoom in. I can get into like the Z buffer reason why this happens, but there's a lot of billboarding that winds up going on when you zoom in because it's all the exact same dimension.
Right.
So the idea is to actually hand tailor these things.
Okay, so you're by hand tailor you mean you're not doing it programmatically, instead you're having somebody create a mesh for each one of these?
Yep. It would be as simple as just building something in Minecraft, but even easier because you wouldn't have to collect the resources. You just go in and click and pull one of 3 colors that any sprite can contain into sort of 3D.
Ah, okay. So to give help me understand this a little bit more. So, I mean, Mario's made up of 4 different sprites, so it's not really fair to make that comparison. Let's look at something like, what object on screen here is comprised of 1 sprite, you know?
The text, honestly. I see you have some text going from what I'm seeing.
Yep.
Those are the only things that are actually 8x8.
Okay, so someone would take that individual sprite and
Mhm.
extrude it itself.
Yeah, yeah. Actually,
Okay.
the text almost looks perfect as is, although you wouldn't want to extrude it too far because
Right.
then when it doesn't seem quite hollow. There's no real sense of depth. I don't have shadows or anything going.
Yeah.
That might be something down the line. So you can see how it's hard to read the text.
Yeah.
So you'd probably hand like make that only one voxel deep.
Gotcha. Okay, and it'd be
But
on a per game basis then, correct?
yep, yeah. The idea is, I think people would get sort of psyched up for the idea of making these and sort of being the person that ports it over.
Yes.
And then because it would just be it's just a 3D array of integers, even though the real value is only 0 through 3
Yep.
of what these colors can actually be. So it'll just be a teeny tiny JSON file or something,
Oh,
and I'll
perfect.
just curate them in a GitHub.
Okay, now I see how it's working. Because
Mm-hmm.
initially when I was reading this, I saw something about creating an editor for it,
Yep,
but
yep.
I didn't quite understand or was able to visualize what that would look like in the end, but now I have a far greater understanding of what this actually looks
Yeah, yeah. And it's weird to introduce it that way, but so the N3S project as a whole is actually sort of to create this thing and then create something that lets people create for it, if that makes sense.
like. Mm-hmm. Yes, I was like, yeah, this is like just fantastic because it gets people back into the groove of playing these older games again, which I don't think ever went away. It's just that we
Yeah.
got so overblown with like AAA and the largest things, the Halos and the Gears of War of the world, and the Call of Duties. So
Yep.
this is kind of like going back to the roots and getting people back into the art of game development when things were, I would say, somewhat more simple. So, some would
Yeah.
argue, some ways it's easier, and other ways it's more difficult.
Right. And the interesting thing, and I've noticed this with everyone of almost all ages, when they engage with Minecraft, there's this weird level that I've never really seen in a game before of technical understanding of how it works. Because like the inner mechanics of this data structure that is this voxel world is so
Yeah.
it's just naked practically. It's right there in front of you. And all sorts of people have all these opinions, even in casual conversation about how it works, and like Notch, and how some people say he's not a super great programmer, even though they're not programmers themselves. And I think exposing this sort of underlying and letting people go in and hand tune these games, or even just seeing them done like this, it has this weird fascination that's wider than even like a true sort of nerdy pursuit, I guess.
Absolutely, because you can really appreciate the work that the developer put into a lot of this, and even more so, I think, if people have the opportunity to build on top of it. Kind of how people got into the modding scene in
Yep.
the '90s when you had things like Doom came out and Unreal Engine
Yeah,
with their
yeah.
first mods. So how did you get started in all of this? Because I mean, I'm a pretty technical person as well. Assembly still kind of blows my mind. I've dabbled in 6502 and 68K assembly, but I mean, how do you get started in something like this, and what are you doing now for work?
Oh, you mean like a sort of programmer origins in general, or specifically related to this project?
We'll start with your programmer origins, and let's go into how you got started with this.
I mean, I think, and like a lot of people, as I've learned, went through the same thing. There's no real one path, and I guess that's why it's so fascinating. I'm sure that's why you ask so many people about this, to get into this technical mindset, because it's really a mindset, an engineer mindset, once you get to
Yes.
know it. Um, and mine, like a lot of people's, was rocky. I picked up like a C++, or even C. What is it? The Richard something, the R and K, I want to say, like that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
classic C. And now you can see I've actually got some audio going now. Finally, I added that 2 nights ago. I finally have audio going
Here you go.
in
10
that shadow
classic
video.
Unix and C books. So the C programming language.
Yeah, yeah. So I
James
picked that
Richard,
up,
Yeah.
read a little bit about it, didn't grasp any of the actual concepts of what engineering is, that I understand now, made some simple calculators. And yeah, that's it. Programming language, second edition. Classic, absolute classic. Way too expensive, though,
Yeah,
for
books
my
are not cheap.
17-year-old self. And it all just kind of fell through my head. And I think what I tell people when they're trying to get into programming, and the next part of this is like, you need a project if you have a certain type of mindset. Some people maybe can just read a book and like pick it all up. If I don't immediately have an actual practical application in front of me, it just goes in one ear out the other.
No,
And
I am the exact same way.
I think a lot of people have that mindset. I think the traditional approach to teaching doesn't really apply to engineering. It's like a tinkering sort of thing. Although, I mean, some people might be differently, or work differently. But what made me like a software developer and happy to say that and get over what is it called, the imposter syndrome, and be like, okay, I'm actually pretty good at this.
And
Is
do people ever get over that? I'm not sure.
no, they never do actually. Um, but I had this pipe dream game idea that like there was no way I'd ever be able to do it by myself, but I tried anyway for 3 years and became, I think, pretty good at like object-oriented programming. It was in Java. The game was called Meta Rogue. I think the website
Okay.
no, it doesn't exist anymore. The idea was that you'd have these roguelikes programmed in a sort of what's the word framework in Ruby that
Okay.
would sit in a
Ooh,
Java
Ruby. Jeez.
in a Java engine with OpenGL, and it would all be handled game logic server side over this sort of common language that would be just made up of game events and things like that.
Okay.
And in these sort of procedurally generated, if you want to do Ruby for it, or grab a gem that someone else made that might have, the D&D 4E or 5E, I forget what it is, rules in a gem that you download for Ruby,
Right.
and just throw it on and do whatever you want with it. And it was all server side, so the clients would almost be seeing, because it's turn-based, to sort of slide
Like a video,
things.
almost a video stream of it. Or would you use
Yeah.
something like sockets to go back and forth, or what?
I no, I think there was this what was it called? Cry something. There's this Java serialization library that then had by the same people that made that really brilliant 2D animation with the tweening and the I forget something bones. I'm forgetting all the names by now, but that got some traction a couple years ago. Spline, I think it's called actually. Spline
Okay.
2D. They took their serialization library and made a really handy networking library that took care of a lot of the UDP, TCP, all that stuff for you. And I used that a lot of like just, serialize an object, send it over there, rebuild it on the other end. Nice and simple. And I had it working pretty well, but I started to realize like, man, no one has any interface to, to really create a character and things like that. And I started to realize like, God, like by the time I'm done with this 10 years from now, it's going to be super dated.
Yep.
So I kind of gave up on that and lost my engineer mojo for about a month. I was like actually super depressed when I stopped working on it. That was like February or something of this year. I was finally like, okay, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah. You thought you could like bit off more than you could chew at that point.
Yeah, but I mean, I had a virtually infinite amount of Minecraft size, virtually infinitely sized worlds. So you could have several of them full of any type of character, something with any type of attributes. Every single thing in there was just virtual. Like if you want to create a variable and assign it to this thing, it was like handling all that. So I had to rebuild the engine like 3 times, and every time I got way, way better at like object-oriented sort of programming paradigms, like
Okay.
everything from the traditional Gang of Four stuff to like newer game programming, paradigms and ideas. And that was it. And now I do software development for this company. I moved down to Arlington, Virginia a couple of years ago now almost. Kept going as an IT consultant the whole time I'm working on this game in my spare time. That's all I'm thinking about all day,
Yeah. Like a
I was
passion
just
project.
just doing sysadmin stuff. Finally, I picked this gig up for this company that I'm still with that does postal and mail related software, and now I'm actually working in the U.S. Postal Service headquarters in D.C.
Okay.
doing software development.
So you're a fellow East Coaster. I like it.
Yep. I mean, I have a 2-year degree in graphic design, and at this point, I've got a pretty decent job, and it was just from tinkering with an insane project for 3 years
Yeah.
in all my spare time.
So you didn't actually study computer science or anything?
No,
like that in school?
no, graphic design.
It's funny because that's what I'm always trying to get across to friends as well. I have a buddy who texts me every single day about this game idea he wants to make, and
Yeah.
a lot of issues that people run into, similar to you before, was, oh, if only I knew how to code, or I didn't go to school for code. You didn't do it, I didn't do it. Half the people I work with didn't go to school for it.
Mhm.
It's the kind of thing where, to your point, if you have a passion project, make it. And that's exactly what I tell this guy every single day is, stop texting me and telling me you want to make something. Just start making it, and then send me the stuff along the way.
It's just a matter of actually wanting to see the thing you're thinking of created
Yes.
and being engaged with the process. And again, I failed utterly to understand C. Well, I understood the basic stuff of the functions, but it's more the matter of how everything ties together is really the most
Exactly.
interesting part to me. At this point, I'm more of like an enterprisey, object-oriented sort of thing. The assembly stuff is fun.
Yeah. So how much assembly do you end up having to write for this emulator then?
So that's the interesting thing is none really.
Wow.
So what happened was, and I don't think if I had to actually write an NES emulator myself, I would never have really followed through on this idea. I would have forgotten about it, moved on to something else.
Yeah, it's a project in and of
Um,
itself.
yeah, that's a serious project, and to get it to run well is, it's taken all these teams collectively like 20 years of doing this.
Yeah, seriously.
Everything from like old Nesticle, if you remember that,
Oh, of course. That's
it
how I
was
started.
gross. that
Yeah.
little mouse pointer, little DOS interface. Everything like that from like 2001, 2000, when I was probably old enough to really start playing around on a computer, and we had internet in my house. And they're still figuring little things out and getting these mappers working right for different types of cartridges. So I don't think there was a chance I was going to do something on my own just to see this particular version of it made.
Right.
So I looked it up, and there's this thing. Have you heard of a RetroArch or LibRetro?
No. Oh, no, I
You have
haven't.
the Nesticle thing. You don't know RetroArch?
No, unless was this something you linked to in the docs over here? Because you had
Uh,
no. Oh,
it
never
was on
mind.
the
I mixed
front
it up
page, I
with the
think. I
Libra thing.
mentioned something about it, but I didn't link to it. So RetroArch is this amazing front end for multiple emulators, and it's very portable. C++. There's a nice Raspberry Pi distro just built around it. And the idea behind it is actually this thing called LibRetro. And this thing's just a brilliant, brilliant project all around.
Oh, whoa! Even better. Sorry to interrupt you. An Emscripten port of it exists. That is awesome. So you can run it inside the browser.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, I
So
love Emscripten. I'm always giving talks on it, and wow, it works perfectly fine. This is badass.
that's cool.
All right.
Is that new?
Yes, September 13th this year.
Wow. That might
Emscripten
help with
is
the Internet Archive stuff, too. I
yeah.
don't know if you follow what they do or what Jason Scott does.
Yes, I do. I love it. So
Mhm.
can you give us like a 30-second overview of what that is?
The Internet Archive?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know all the details. I follow Jason Scott. I've met him, geez, like 10 times in real life because I go to information security conferences. I run
Yep.
with that kind of crowd, and they always drag me along. So he's always there. Um, but he works for the Internet Archive. I don't even know what he does. I think it's very informal. He just archives things obsessively,
Yeah.
and he's a huge gamer, game history fan. So he's actually archived and made playable in the browser. It's like he did thousands of Apple II games. Um, I know he's uploading more retro games, but they actually run right in the browser. It's like a JavaScript. I don't know what this InScript thing is. I've actually never heard of it.
I'll explain that as soon as you finish.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like a. Oh wow, you have MSX running. Jesus.
I love the MSX. Love it, love it, love it.
SD Snatcher.
Yeah. Oh,
Um, so they're all playable right in the browser, and there's all these questionable issues about it, and there's always drama around everything Jason does. So there's all that going on too. And legality, possible issues, and that's always
yeah.
an interesting fight. But yeah, it's a really amazing project.
It's essentially a way of archiving the
Hmm.
internet. So saving websites and copies of websites so that years from now you can look back on what the internet was. And we're probably very similar in age. But like, I mean, growing up in the 90s and playing PC games, you had things like MSN, Zone. See, now it's just called MSN or zone.msn.com.
Hmm.
So we see Zone.
Remember all the? This is slightly more recent, but all the Yahoo games that they had
Yep.
with all, I don't know, you play all those board games, things like that.
Yep.
Sony had this thing going in the early 2000s that I used to troll people on.
They had Kali.net and Heat.net.
I think I knew Heat.
Heat had like it was really bizarre to look at. Yeah, I have to dig into this some other way, but essentially it was a way of creating lobbies in the browser when like IE3 was out, IE2, and you could basically click on the left-hand side of the page and it would say, I want to play Age of Empires, and then you find all these different rooms, and the rooms would just be titled like 2 vs 2. You'd hop into that lobby, find 3 other randos in there, and say, okay, let's set the rules, and we're good to go. And really what it would do is just have a chat lobby, and then as soon as you hit the host, hit launch, it would send a message to your PC and deep link into the actual executable itself and set up all the IP addresses for all the other machines.
Cool.
It was awesome. And for when it came out, like almost 20 years ago, it absolutely blew my mind. And then the Emscripten thing, so what this is Emscripten is basically built on top of LLVM, like low-level virtual machine, at least that's what
Really?
it used to stand for. And open source project started by Alon Zakai, who is a researcher and engineer at Mozilla. So Tim and a bunch of the wonderful folks at Mozilla who are responsible for things like the Firefox browser. They put together this compiler that allows you to take C and C++ code, run it through the compiler, and you run it just like you would anything else like GNU or GCC. Run it through there, and it spits out a highly optimized JavaScript version of this using a language called ASM.js, assembly JavaScript, as one large file. So look at the browser as simply another compilation platform or target, just like you would for ARM, x86, x64. Exact same thing, but it says, I want to build one large JavaScript file for the browser and read it all. And that's what this thing is here.
That's interesting. You know, it's funny because I was just thinking like 3 hours ago, and I hadn't thought about this in forever. Did you see that guy that did his best to, I don't know if it was LLVM, because I know there's all these interlocking sort of technologies based around this new idea of like super low level common languages. But it was someone who tried to decompile like Mario for the NES into like a common low level VM language.
Oh, no way. So try to spit out something like JavaScript or even C, C++ that you can actually
I think he was trying to go for C. Okay. And I think he had a lot of issues doing it, but it was a fascinating, it was a long read. I kind of skimmed it, but
yeah.
I remember thinking it was pretty cool at the time.
It is fascinating seeing how people put together these old games. I don't know what it is. Like, I feel like 10, 15, 20 years ago, we were so limited as to what we could do with the hardware and software we could work with. Whereas today, it's really like the world is your oyster, right? We were just talking about the GTX 1070 before the show started. Whereas back then, you had like very limited hardware. Everyone had identical machines, at least for consoles. And you were trying to figure out how to get the most out of it that you could.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the same thing. I'm sure at some point during this, I'll talk a little bit about the PPU, how it works and everything. And a lot of the little shortcuts they took and ways they optimized these data structures and how they interlock and interact is pretty crazy. And on that, you were asking about the assembly thing, right?
Yes.
And I started to talk about libretro.
Yes.
So libretro is what sort of powers RetroArch, and it's this really fantastic project where basically these people looked at every emulator out there and decided like, okay, these all work in this same. They all do roughly the same thing. So if we had an API that had them, take in controller inputs that we defined, or structures that we defined, and output video, and all this other stuff, all these emulators can implement it, and then you can run them on multiple platforms, or you can keep them in like a multi-emulator environment very easily.
Yeah.
And what this is, and what I was looking for, basically, the idea in my head was like, there has to be something. Someone had to have made like an NES emulator library, where you can just boot up an NES somewhere in code that's interface agnostic, because a lot of these emulators have like heavy interfaces. I'd hate to have to try and run one and encapsulate it and hide it and like pull values out of it. I don't think I would have bothered with that.
Right.
But fortunately, there was a port of Nestopia, which is one of the better emulators out there for the NES. That and FCE are, I guess, kind of tied.
Yeah, FCE is probably what I use most of the time too.
Mm-hmm. I think it's the one most people favor, but Nestopia is also fantastic. And there you go. It's just this little DLL you can download open source.
I downloaded it earlier today just to peek at some of the C++ in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it just runs. You have a Nintendo emulator that's running in memory. You just throw it a file path, or the raw data from the file, however it works, and you tell it to execute frame every time you want it to, and it does it, and it spits out the results.
Awesome.
And it was complicated to learn it because you have to. I'm not a C++ pro. I'm mostly just trying to write Java or C# as C++. Unfortunately, they're almost identical. I was shocked to find out in version 11 or C++ 11 that they have like all these shared pointers, and it's practically the same thing as like Java. You're basically just writing all this boilerplate to do the same exact automatic memory management. I was kind of surprised at that, but it's cool. It's the right way to do it, I think. Yeah. So I've been trying to learn that and like do that all right, and like early on, just to get this thing running, because it was the first thing I was trying to do. You have to like create functions and then like pass this thing, or it has a function that it calls automatically, and you pass it that, and that function that you have to write like grabs the pointer to your function, because the libretro core, as it's called, which is any machine or something that it is that you're trying to run, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, anything, it needs to run functions. It can't just wait for you to ask it to do stuff sometimes. Yeah. Like mid-frame, it's got to like call back and like grab your audio buffer and all that stuff. So you have to like pass it your functions that it wants to call when it needs it, and you have to do the same thing. And I almost gave up early on at that point, because I was like heavy C++ stuff early on.
Yeah. And
But
that language can be disgusting because they throw so much into it.
yeah, it's not a bad language. I guess it's brilliant. I wouldn't really know, but I'm much more of like a C# guy at this point. That's pretty much me.
C# is like the best parts of C++ and Java put together.
Mm-hmm. And more even, I'd say. But yeah, so I was lucky enough to find this thing, and libretro even has this API. They were very extremely intelligent in designing this because you can sort of take these functions that take parameters, you just pass it an enumeration or something, and it can do whatever it wants to on the other end. So that there's this grab memory thing if you want to do save states, although that's also sort of built in.
Mm-hmm.
You just have like a grab all system RAM like as a byte array pointer, like just give it back to me. So I was able to just very quickly add to Nestopia like a grab all VRAM, everything in the PPU, pass it back, and then all I really, well, ideally, this is the way I was hoping the program would work. It turned out to be more complicated. I'm just like, all right, I'll grab the VRAM, just go byte by byte, and just create like a sort of object-oriented sort of just like a tree of just structs of all 64 sprites in the OAM object attribute memory. Okay. All the tiles of the background, we'll just grab that, make it a nice little object-oriented thing. Just a class, which I wound up calling PPU snapshot, and just render it.
It's all in C++ again, correct?
Yep. It turned out to be a little bit more complicated. I don't know if you wanted me to go into those details.
By all means, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to what you're stuck on.
I'm not stuck on much, fortunately. There's still some bugs, but the PPU I'm emulating almost perfectly, I want to say, for most games, and that's really good. Okay. So what wound up happening is there's actually a lot of things that the NES does mid-screen to those values that I needed, so I had to start tracking how they change, scale line by scale line. And even that, for some games, isn't going to be accurate enough. Like, I think Marble Madness has a sort of sprite limit. There's these two sprite tables. I can get into that later. Usually they're background and sprites, or background foreground, if you want to consider it. Both halves of this area in memory. That is all the sprites that can be drawn at any given time. And Marble Madness, like, they needed more for, like, the static parts. Mm-hmm. So, like, they actually had to build something into the card itself to like know exactly where it was in scanline rendering because the NES doesn't provide that actually, and like changes stuff mid scanline at these exact pixels. And I don't know if I'm ever going to get into that exact. See that right there when it says time to finish practice race? That right there is using a different table that it's swapping in and out mid scale line, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that, but it turns out there's a lot of stuff that it does that I need to track, and I sort of need to rebuild that timeline. So as I'm rendering top to bottom, even though it's in 3D, I have to like cut up these meshes and draw different parts of them if these things change. I basically divide the screen up into all the states it ever was when it's unique, and I sort of render those piece by piece, actually.
So, like, what always blew my mind about Marble Madness is it has that 3D feel, largely because of its like 3/4 perspective. Yeah,
the isometric one.
Yeah. This was done by Mark Cerny when he was very young, I think like 20 years old. And for those of you who don't know who he is, he's now, I think, the technical lead at Sony, at least on the PS4. So he's like the head designer, head architect behind that.
Wow.
So I have no idea how he did this at like 20 years old. Blew my mind. And then he led Naughty Dog for a while. So Crash Bandicoot, he did all kinds of cool stuff. But so we'll look at this. The graphics blow me away. And then I see like there's no transparency behind the text. You notice that?
Yeah.
Like for 240, 52, and even this, it's just like a black screen right there. I don't know why. Maybe it had to do with the limitation of the number of sprites you could draw on screen at once, at least horizontally on the plane. But
yeah. So let's get into some of the data structures
by all means.
Behind it that I had to pull into. There's these two main ones. One of them I already mentioned is object attribute memory. Mm-hmm. And when I looked at this, I went to this place, NES Dev Wiki. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's this fantastic repository of all the info you could want, all the mappers, lists of games, and even sort of these little, miniature tutorials on how these things work.
Awesome.
And this is the first thing I looked at, which is like the obvious one, is like, oh, how do you draw sprites? And this made me think like, oh, I can do this. Object attribute memory is just this 256 byte area in memory that can store up to 64 sprites. You can only have 64 sprites on screen at once, which is different from the background, which is this sort of fixed grid of sprites, or technically you call them sprites, but tiles, images. But anything that can move outside of that fixed grid to any XY position on the screen is a sprite, an object attribute memory. And these 4 bytes are just like, it's not exactly in order, but it's like X, Y, 0 through 255 for each of those. And then which palette to use for that particular sprite, and then this other, or actually the last 2 are sort of broken up. Each bit in these 2 bytes means like, is it mirrored or flipped, or any other little bit of metadata on that particular sprite. So for that, all I have to do is just pull those values and just render. If it were like perfectly simple like that, it's basically like, oh, I'll just render these 64 sprites exactly where they go.
Yeah.
Although there are these things called control registers. Well, they're just called registers, which are these bytes where each bit or little collections of bits have different flags for how the screen renders, how colors can actually get manipulated. If a game turns like black and white or fades out, sometimes it's using these flags that actually affect the colors on this weird electronic level on the PPU. But there's a flag that's called the vertical sprite. I forget what it's called exactly. But it's a lot of games, the sprites are usually taller, like Castlevania 2 is an example. And it uses this, Zelda 2 also. Usually they're like a couple sprites high. What this thing does, it lets you use 128 sprites cleverly by assuming that in this mode, every time you draw a sprite, it's going to go to the memory position adjacent or right after it and draw the next sprite directly below. So that's an example of like, okay, I have to draw these things, and I load up Castlevania 2 or Zelda 2, and it's like, oh, every other thing isn't drawn, and I have to look it up and be like, oh, geez, that's what this does. I have to draw, and it's simple. It's relatively elementary, and that's why I'm like, oh, I didn't have to learn assembly or anything like that. It's just kind of figuring out the logic and sort of recreating it, but it's all relatively high level.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here thinking you're having to dive into like 6502 and talk to the machine itself.
Nope. I mean, the emulator already does that. What I did have to do, though, is I had to take the Nestopia LibRetro version.
Yeah.
Although I think it's sort of a shared Visual Studio project from the actual thing. So you load those up, and I dug into the PPU header and C++ files, and I sort of added these things that listen. I basically had to make a class of this thing that would listen the whole rendering process and grab all these values for me.
Okay.
And at the end, it just grabs all the the data, like the big chunks of memory for me at the end.
Yep.
So that was actually the most complicated thing I had to do in terms of like really interacting with the NES. At that point, it was all the Nestopia development team's concept in their code of how this stuff is stored.
Okay.
So grabbing like the OAM, that thing of memory, they have a struct for it. I just have to do a little quick mem copy function and just pull it over.
Perfect.
And then, everything else, they wrote pretty good code. I don't know how many people worked on it or who did. I think there's one maintainer mainly now. I didn't really look into who it all was, but
yeah.
It's just, this one struct, I'm going to grab it. All these CPU things, they're just flags. Although I kind of avoid those, and I do wind up grabbing stuff like right from memory for a lot of these flags, because I don't know, the way they stored that was a little bit weird, and I couldn't quite decipher it. But
yeah, especially if I'm not leaving comments all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Go ahead. I was going to say, like, I love that people make all this out of nothing more than passion projects, right? They don't get paid for it. It's extremely technical, extremely difficult. And obviously they're smart people, so their time could be spent making lots of money doing other projects, but they do this because they absolutely love it, just as you do.
Yeah. It's just a puzzle. It's so fascinating. I'm not nearly as smart as a lot of the people that actually managed to figure this stuff out to start with. And that's even just using, I don't know what you call it, but like, ways to like just read the electronics or look at the circuit boards up close. I was a little involved actually in the 3DS. I wasn't like super involved, but I was following very closely how people were managing to hack that. At that point, I think those people crowdsourced just with their own money, sending a 3DS out and having it like super zoomed in with like an electron microscope to like look at the PCB up close.
Yep.
It was like $20,000 or whatever they raised to go send it out and get like actual high-res imagery of the circuitry itself to break it down and figure this stuff out. So it's amazing what people do.
Oh, yeah. So have you seen this video before? Sega Saturn cracked after 20 years?
Yeah, wasn't that recent?
Yes, a couple months ago. Yep.
I had this in my other monitor. I sort of listened to it idly. It was a pretty long video, and I was actually working on this project as I had it up.
This thing like blew my mind when I saw it. And then one of my recent coworkers, this guy Andrew Ritano, who just joined us at Microsoft, is like very big into all this too. And it I love having this like little scene of developers who are super passionate about this, like taking these things apart. And what this gentleman did, he's a PhD student in Australia, I believe. Took apart the Sega Saturn, disassembled the entire thing, and realized that he can read a lot of these values from, I believe it's like the media expansion port on the back of the device, like where you'd store the battery for saving with your BIOS. Yeah.
Huh.
So what he did was he attached a little hard drive to it now, wrote a bunch of code, and now he can load up games directly into that. So things like Daytona USA, which we'll get into a little bit later over here somewhere. He tears apart this entire thing. And much to your point, I love this because it is a puzzle for him the entire time. People have been trying to do this for 2 decades and have not figured it out. But also what I like is that he loads this from a hard drive, Daytona USA. What I love about this is most of the people who architected these consoles are probably still alive somewhere in Japan and have no idea that people are passionate about this, that they care about it, that they're doing any of this. And here we are on the other side of the world trying to take these things apart and explain it to people. So I'm curious to see what happens 20 years from now. Like, will people look back on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One and say, I want to take that thing apart?
Yeah, yeah. Although I guess they're becoming more and more like PCs. All of them are becoming a lot more homogeneous.
Yes.
And the level of copy protection is just insane. I guess like every hardware generation, we're like, oh, no one will ever emulate this, and yet we're sitting here with like the amazing Dolphin project for GameCube and Wii.
Seriously,
it's just mind blowing. I think Dolphin is really like the holy grail of like emulation projects at this point. Like,
can you explain what Dolphin is for her?
Dolphin is I want to say, I don't know much about it. I want to say it's a GameCube and Wii emulator, but I mean, on top of being technically amazing, it's picked up a lot of steam because the developers are really great at showing off what they do, and like I don't know, I want to compare it to like acrobatics or something, just these amazing displays of hacking and like just mind-blowing performance they'll get out of this one release and like get really excited about it. So it's been getting a lot of love lately.
And the games look absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, like Mario Galaxy, I think I see you starting to load that up now. Like in 1080p, it looks incredible.
Oh my god!
Especially because there's not a lot of textures. I think there's a lot of flat shading in that game.
Yep. Same thing.
So
with
it just looks so crisp.
Oh no, where is this?
So we're able to play Wii games in what a lot of people said like we should have been able to do in 1080p back in the day, or 720, whatever it would have been.
So let's see, Dolphin emulator, Wind Waker, 1080p. This game is absolutely beautiful. I went through it again 2 years ago, and here it is, 1080p in Dolphin. It looks just as good as the port they just did to. So this is a video from 3 years ago. Here we go, exactly 3 years ago this week.
Yeah, Wind Waker it seemed like an early one that they were really trying to go for, the Wind Waker.
Yep.
Port, and GameCube.
Well, these visuals are timeless too, right? Because it's cell shading, and I remember when Nintendo first pitched this idea, people thought, "Oh, Zelda, it's a kiddie game, it looks terrible," and look at it, like it's timeless in the way it appears now.
Absolutely.
So now stepping away from some of this, because we could be fascinated by this emulation.
Yeah.
How are you tying into the HoloLens? What's that experience like, and what gave you the idea for that?
So I think the idea behind the whole project actually was, I was reading Ars Technica, which is like one of my favorite news sources, and there was this other project called 3D NES. I'm sure you've seen that at some point, right?
Yes.
This guy Geode, I don't know his nationality or where he's from exactly, because he keeps kind of quiet for the most part, but made this thing, and his take on it was, I'm gonna write an NES emulator in like Java script or something like that, and then use an algorithm to look at the 2D output of every single frame and try to pull 3D shapes out of it.
Yeah.
Which I think might even be a more fascinating approach than I've even taken. Even throwing the HoloLens in there, that's just a really amazing concept. And the level of accuracy in a lot of games is stellar.
Yep.
I'm so excited about all this stuff. A lot of these things that inspired me are just such amazing feats that I can't help but freak out about them sometimes.
Oh no, absolutely.
And Kyle Orland, yeah, he wrote that article. He's pretty cool. I've been in touch with him a little bit about this project.
Great author. Yeah, he's a friend, fellow Pennsylvania person. I think he's in Pittsburgh now.
I'm pretty sure he lives in D.C.
Oh, he made a move
Because
there.
I live across the river, and I was like, we chatted a little bit when he was on vacation. I was like, hey, if you ever want to try this thing on, I'm
Aha.
across the river. I'm pretty sure he's DC. I could be wrong.
Ah, okay.
Um,
Yeah, I last saw him like 2 years ago at Too Many Games Festival. That's what it was in Philly.
oh, cool.
It's like a retro game festival.
So, and he, the amazing thing, the reason I reached out to him was he's covered this, and he covered it with such an amazing amount of detail.
Oh yeah,
Like
he's a
he dug
fantastic
into the
writer.
he dug into the nitty gritty of everything, and even the new retro NES, the mini one that Nintendo's releasing, he
Yeah,
dug into
the
all sorts
official
of
one.
stuff about that, and like figured out like the colors and the way it worked. And of course, I'm actually like trying to program with this as I'm going along, so it's interesting to see someone else like super into it, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
So he wrote this article, and I'm like, oh, that's a great idea. At the same time, my boss, this great guy, Assam, who owns the company I work for, said like, oh, I ordered 2 Hololens, by the way. We were wave 4, so it took until I developed this probably for 4 months before I actually got my hands on a HoloLens.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, this looks cool. I'd love to see this on the HoloLens. Like, can I port it? I started to look into it. And then when I started to... The other thing is, as amazing as the 3D NES project is, a lot of games don't look really good on it. And even a lot of games like Mega Man, there was this one person who, or I don't know, maybe it was even a team that dug through and made it, optimized it to look really good on 3D NES. And it
Yep.
looks great, but a lot of games are a little bit imperfect. So I started to think like, how else could you approach this problem? And that's when I started to do what I was saying before when I went on NES Dev Wiki. I'm like, what's in there? Can I pull these things? Can I reinterpret them entirely
Yeah.
from the raw innards, or of how this thing works? And that was the start of the whole project. So really, the main port is the desktop one, just because I love how it looks.
Yep.
And I think most people will be able to play it and make these edited meshes on it. And the HoloLens, as I found out, performance, I'll get into that in a bit, but the performance was not fantastic. It's not a super beefy device.
Right.
For a lot of heavy 3D stuff, as simple as this looks like it is to render. But
Yeah, I'm trying
so
to
I'm
look
like,
through the there's another piece of documentation I saw about adding holographic capabilities to middleware, and
mhm.
essentially they're just showing you how to, because HoloLens is all DirectX.
Yeah, so I mean, the funny thing is, if you look at the HoloLens project, because N3S is all open source,
Yep.
it is that code. I copy pasted the starter project with the spinning cube. When it renders my thing, it's the line of code is spinning cube, render. That's
funny.
actually it. It's a total hack.
That
I
was
have to
my
admit.
first HoloLens app too. Was I just started writing DirectX like that?
Yeah, yeah. So I started writing this whole thing. Then when we got the HoloLens in, I kept working on the desktop version because I had to make it work better before I ported it over. And then my boss let me take one home. And it probably took maybe 4 or 5 days over a weekend. And I took it home on a Friday, and by next Friday, I was taking those videos. So it was relatively simple to do.
Awesome.
To get into the 3D nitty gritty, which I'm sure I don't know. Have you done a lot of DirectX stuff?
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a matter of my first approach was, okay, this is weird because I have this application where I have the camera controlled by like my Xbox 360 controller, and now I need to pass that over to this HoloLens app, which is going to give me some approximation of where the head is in the room,
Right.
what the viewing angle is, and I'll just map that over to my camera and run that code instead.
Yep.
But I realized it was significantly simpler,
Mm.
especially because I was trying to throw this together kind of quickly so I could give it back, which wound up not really being an issue. But
Yeah.
all I did was I basically just took my shader code, threw it at their shader code, and
Yep.
said like, "Hey, have fun! Like, you already have the view matrix and
Right.
projection matrix being updated. Like, take it, just run with it, and I'll just throw my models into the world matrix." And it worked. All of a sudden, it's just in front of me. Like, it was almost too easy. Like this moment I'd been building up to for 5 or 6 months was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, there's Mario. It's in real life."
Yeah,
That's
you're sitting
cool.
there scared for a moment, like, is this thing even going to build?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I got it working very. I mean, the first thing, I just threw my code at it, and what you get is just the 2D image of this Mario game. Well, technically slightly 3D because of some perspective, when you're just looking at it head on in my 3D code. But that was just being rendered onto each eye, like flat, almost like I was looking at a monitor.
Right.
And that was kind of funny. And then it's like, okay, so I had that running, so I knew it worked.
Yep. And that's so, like, to be clear, there are two different kinds of HoloLens apps, right? There's just like flat 2D apps, and then what are called holographic apps,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
have use your touch input, transparency. They can use your gaze with your eye tracking, things like that.
hmm Yeah, so I mean, I think the 2D apps are really just UWP apps. Like if it's a Windows app, you can just throw it right over and it'll just float in space, right?
Exactly, and that's what I started doing with Monogame a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
Which
really?
one? Yep. I don't think anyone working with Monogame had a Hololens at that point. So first thing I wanted to do was I already knew how Unity worked, very familiar with that. Loved Monogame and XNA, so I figured let me try getting this to work. And out of the box, it just worked perfectly fine. So then I started to dive into the source to start adding the actual holographic implementation, very similar to what you were doing with the NES.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I'd love to have done this whole thing in C Sharp. That would have been fantastic. When I was like learning, how to talk to the program, that was its own thing, and I'm sure you have to like sort of. I know there's a few methods to like build a bridge from unmanaged code to managed code.
Yep. Well, have you looked at Sharp DX?
Yeah, Sharp DX is a pretty great. That's just the DirectX
Yep.
sort of port, mostly
Yep,
port.
C# wrapper around.
Yeah.
DirectX.
And there's been I don't know why they dropped XNA support. It would have been so great if
Don't
Microsoft
get me
really.
started. Don't get me started.
A lot of people were pretty disappointed. It's so weird that there isn't some like serious solution out there yet. SharpDX is fantastic. Monogames is great. But like a Microsoft back kind of thing. That was great for a little while. But so I would have loved to do that, but like I started looking at the documentation for just even how to simply wrap like the libretro thing with all these weird function pointers and like pull it into managed code, and I was like, no, I'll just start hacking away at this because I really want to dig into and figure out how this PPU thing worked and if I could
Exactly.
pull this off. So I just started going at it, and yeah, it's all right. C++ is okay. So.
That's a good language, I guess. So are you tied in with this 3D NES emulator at all, or are you doing your own separate thing completely? Because this looks very different from what you're doing.
It's very different. No, there's no connection. Like when I post about the HoloLens video I took on Reddit, people were like, "Oh, talk to this guy. You guys should like work together." And he seems like a cool dude, but
It's just very different projects.
yeah, it's just a very different project.
Yeah, because you see like his camera's kind of offset the whole time, and you're like looking through the textures; they all seem transparent.
Yeah, I'm watching like the Zelda 2 footage, and I think how old is that particular video? Like February 19th.
Yeah,
I'm sure this
February.
game looks way better right now. He made huge improvements. Another thing you'll notice is that on the edge, the 8x8 tiles are sort of loading, so there's this very jagged
Right.
look. He's fixed that as well.
Okay.
That was a weird problem to get around because I have these 3D meshes, and there's some weird memory limits that I'm running into. So if you take a game that has 128 KB of character data, which is like the pattern data or images or sprites, that's 8,192 different sprites. So that's 8,192 different 3D meshes I have to build,
Right.
which at their most complicated, if it's a full, and I could definitely optimize this, I haven't done it yet, but if it's like a full block, and let's say it's 8 by 8 by 8, that means each side is 64 triangles.
Right.
Which have to be completely independent for certain reasons. They can't really share vertices in case they have different colors across these hard edges. So 64 times however much, I don't know. But these meshes are actually pretty big, and that's kind of why it doesn't run super great on HoloLens.
Yep.
Of course, if it was one flat color, I could just optimize it into just one
Right.
square made up of two triangles, but I'm not doing that just yet because the idea is that people will edit them to be much more complicated.
Yep.
More than likely. So that's kind of more of a
You're
down the
trying to
line
keep it
thing.
as simple as possible for now.
Yeah. So, what was I saying before that?
We were talking about this 3D NES, how it was different from what you were doing. It was loading in sprites on either side of the screen, or it looks like it's trying to load in the frame
Right.
data.
So, this is the interesting thing. This is a big problem that I really like solving. At each edge of a screen, you have, an 8x8 sprite, which as you're scrolling is partially revealed.
Right.
And I have these very full 3D models that you either render them or you don't, which is the problem you're seeing on there, which I think he's fixed by now. And there's a few solutions to that in like shader code, but my solution, the problem is like if I were to use shader code to just like not render vertices past a certain limit,
Yep.
you'd see through these things. You'd see inside of them,
Right.
But I really want you to like see the brick forming as you go
Yeah.
along. And if you watch like my NES Mario video, you see that happening on the edge. I think I
Yep.
focused on it at one point. So I have like these. I actually have like an 8x8, so 64 separate meshes per sprite of each individual sort of straw of like voxels along the z-axis
Yep.
that I render only the part that's there. And it's weird because a sprite might be partially hidden from the top or the bottom, depending on scrolling, and I can't predict that exactly. So that was my way around that, and that was actually kind of fascinating to figure out.
Many tricks of the trade.
Yep, yep.
And now the next trick will be getting something like Batman Return of the Joker. So have you seen this game before?
Is that like the main Batman game that came out?
Well,
that's like the one everyone speedruns?
No, that's the first one. That was just like Batman 1989. This one was fantastic. Also made by Sunsoft. Came out 2 years later, 91, so 2 years later.
Wow.
But it is probably the prettiest NES game I've ever seen. And also just look at the number of layers of parallax they have going on. So it looks like we'll say like an early era Genesis or early era SNES game, but all done on the NES. Soundtrack is incredible. And just the number of items they're able to draw on screen at once is amazing. But even parallax, right? I think NES could do like one layer of parallax, and they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What seems like 5 layers here.
So if we look at this train thing, and this is actually something else I want to talk about because it was very fascinating to me. And this is the first thing I really had to dig into, like a line by line or deeper level to grab these values. The way that the background works is you have these things called name tables.
Yep.
It's just a weird name, but it's a 32 by 30, which is if you make that times 8 each side, it's like 256 by 240 or whatever the resolution of the screen is on the NES.
Yeah.
And you can have in the system memory, you can have up to 2 of them. And there's all these great low-level things it does you can scroll along this and then sort of like populate the next part of the screen as you're scrolling, by however many tiles you want to do it per frame.
Just like prepare the screen for what's going to come.
Prepare the screen to where it's scrolling. So it can be either garbage data or it can be like old data from the other side of the level that's still being overwritten. And there's 2 of these things in memory. So you can actually scroll directly left to right or directly up and down. That's a lot of the times where games like Metroid or Castlevania or Mega Man have this open the door, walk through it. There's like this shifting where you have no control, and all of a sudden you're able to go up and down.
Yeah,
is because it actually doesn't have to recalibrate anything, but it sort of like is rewriting those areas, and it's actually setting a switch to say like, okay, we're mirroring. I think if you were to go up and down in Metroid, you'd have horizontal mirroring because the images above and below are unique. But if you were to scroll to the right, you'd start seeing a repeat of the other side of the screen because there's no more data for it to go.
So,
although there are these flags in the registers that you can, and Mega Man 3 use that. You see that glitch when I'm talking to Proto Man in mine? The left 8 pixels of the screen are garbage because I'm ignoring this flag that says don't render that. I'll have to add that at some point. So basically you can hide that to sort of buffer if you need diagonal movement. Yep. The other way to have diagonal movement is you can actually provide 2 of your own name tables using RAM on the cartridge.
Okay.
And that's how games like Gauntlet get like full diagonal scrolling cleanly across a big map, is because they're actually providing more. And I had to emulate in just like C++ code, sort of have these classes and structs that do the same thing. And when you ask for a tile, let's say you're rendering at the first or name table 0, which is on the left, and you're 7 tiles in. Once you start rendering along and you've asked for 25, all of a sudden you're going to the next one. So it has to fail over. It doesn't fail over, but it goes and grabs that memory automatically. That's like just how the CPU is built.
Yeah.
In the NES to actually work automatically, but I had to add all that. And scrolling was the big thing that really threw me off because that is, of course, done mid-frame. And what's interesting is if you think of Super Mario, and you can even, I know there's an image on my site that displays this in a little animation I made. Super Mario has because you only have 64 sprites and you have like all that data on top, it says like Mario, your points, the time, all that stuff.
Yeah.
You can draw that. I think that's almost 64 all by itself. So that's actually the name table. And what it does is it scrolls like a typewriter. It goes to chain, new frame, draws those first 32 pixels, or I don't know, maybe it's like 24 or something like that, and then slides the level over to where it's actually being rendered and then continues rendering.
Okay.
So that's how parallax actually works, is they have to do that. And something else that's rather fascinating, Nintendo apparently, I guess this has later been revealed to be kind of like a false idea they had. I don't know much about it, but they didn't feel that they could use these sort of proprietary, hardware methods to detect what scan line was being rendered on the actual TV itself or in the video output. So they added this neat little thing. Those flags I was talking about earlier that contain various bits of information on how to render, there's this thing called Sprite Zero hit. And if you look at Mario on NES, the OAM has those 64 sprites, and
Mhm.
Sprite Zero is special in this weird way. You can render it just like anything else, but in code, if you render Sprite Zero and you have a non-transparent pixel, so like one you're actually drawing, that is over a transparent pixel in the name table or the background,
Okay.
it sets this flag. So the reason that coin is like flashing on the lowest part of the Mario title bar up top is because that sets a flag that lets it know it's reached that scan line and actually knows to switch.
Okay.
And so if you play some of these NES games, you'll notice these little animated motifs or little things going on in the menu that are actually guides to let the games know, like, okay, we're ready to actually scroll over. And it
Yeah.
sets a flag that is, you can set it immediately once it sees it, because that value isn't pulled over in this crazy way that I have to figure out how it works, to emulate it until the next scan line is hit, and then the sort of origin of the screen is reloaded. Very, very weird stuff. So parallax scaling like that is really impressive. That game almost certainly has something built into the cartridge
Yep.
that actually lets it detect what scan line it's rendering. I would say scale line, but I think it's scan line when you're talking about like CRTs and stuff.
Yes, exactly.
I always heard it as scale line growing up. So
Oh,
that's how I
really?
say it.
Was
Yeah,
that
I
just
don't
when
know
you
why.
heard it in your head, or?
Yeah, I must have just heard it in my head or read it wrong one day. So I'm like, oh, scale lines.
Yeah, so
But-
this is a fantastic game. Like, if you ever get a chance to play it, it is well worth your time. Soundtrack is incredible too.
It's terrifying me right now because I'm seeing it. I know that all this stuff isn't going to work unless I start to tweak things. I know it's going to throw some new thing that my emulated PPU will not know how to handle. Because
Well,
even like Castlevania 2, I'm trying to render because that has some of that diagonal stuff going on. It's going
Yeah.
crazy. I think it used to work, but now it's not. Because some change made.
And to your point about the hardware running on the game itself, a lot of these games, Sunsoft did have their own chips, largely for sound and sometimes for graphics. That's how you got things like, well, they didn't do VRC6, right? Konami did that. Sunsoft had their own thing, which sounded like eerily familiar or similar. But that's how they handle a lot of this too. Largely extra RAM on the card itself.
Yeah, and that's why some of those things would be so expensive too. It's crazy.
Like, you've actually got to produce that hardware yourself, get it onto the cart, and then ship it out. So you're paying an additional cost, but your games look like this and absolutely blow everything else in that system away.
Yeah, yeah. I'm seeing that shaking background, and that's weird to me. And it's great because I see NES games running, and it's like, oh, okay, like, how do they do that exactly? Oh,
Yep.
the Joker, apparently? I don't know.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
like-
that's looking like some last boss material right there.
Like Kirby on the NES. I'm sure you've seen this before. Come on, thing, go away. I'm trying to get this top video. So Kirby on the NES looked fantastic too, by HAL Laboratories. I'm trying to get to the part where they have like a 3D rotating woods, like he's in a tree.
Yeah, yeah, I think Battletoads has the same thing later on, too. Not that anyone ever got that far.
Yeah, seriously, that game was, if you like pain, that's the game for you. I don't know, I can't find it in here, but
Yeah, there were some interesting techniques there. I think one of the things I point out in my own documentation, I think that's how that screen shake in the back of Batman worked, was you don't actually copy the sprites you want to use into memory
yep.
on the NES. It's mapped directly from the cartridge. And that's, I think, part of the reason why they're called mappers, that know how to play different games, like those sort of, I don't know, I want to say like BIOS or something, that's not it, but like these sort of definitions of how the cartridge worked, is you'd actually say like that, oh, I think the pattern table is what it's called, all the graphics that you can render, 512 sprites in total.
Yep.
They're called the left and right side, which are 256 sprites each. And you
Okay.
can select one half of it to use for the background and the foreground. They can use the same one, and they can change that throughout the screen, like in Marble Madness, sometimes in a very specific amount.
Yeah.
What
Have you
was I
seen,
saying?
have you seen this one before?
Gimmick. This is a really cool speedrun game.
Yeah,
I don't know
and
if
the
you ever watched
soundtrack
like
is so good.
Yeah, yeah.
But also by Sunsoft, and use one of their custom chips too, not only for the audio but for like some of the visuals itself.
I didn't know that they used audio chips for these games. I'd never considered that before.
Yep. VRC6 was probably the most common one at that point, done by Konami. They had like VRC7 used on one or two games, and it gave them 2 to 3 extra channels for the game itself.
Yeah. I played, when I got audio working on Mario, I was surprised. I forgot how much of the music cuts out every time you hit something or any sound effect happens.
Right, because you can only have so many at once.
You ever have a Gamecom or Gamescom, whatever it was?
No, that thing was terrible.
Yeah, it was. I got it for my birthday.
Resident Evil
97 or whatever.
Gamescom.
Yeah, there was this Batman
Gamecom.
game for it, and it had like one sound channel, so you had this like 4 second music loop that would just restart every time you did any action. And it was
Yeah.
the most frustrating thing. Me and my brother still like mock that, sort of try and sing it
And the
with the
games
sound
were
effects
just
at each other.
fugly. Like, look at Resident Evil 2. I mean, you're getting like maybe 2 frames a second. Although I can tell this is the gun shop from the beginning of the game. The UI looks decent, but it was just terribly underpowered. It's like one of those mobile Nokia phones or something, flip phone you'd get in like 1990 or maybe 2001.
What was that thing everyone called a taco? It was like Nokia's Eat something.
Was it a Sidekick? Let's see.
No, it had some crazy name. It was like supposed to be the game phone.
Engage.
Engage, yeah, that thing was awful.
Yeah.
I play with it at like Media Play back in the day or whatever.
Just look at this.
Man.
Painful.
So, a lot of animation, I was saying before, in the NES are rather, sort of surprisingly, a lot of animations, it can't update that much of the screen. I mean, pixel-wise, it's being re-rendered every frame, of course, like anything else, but it can't change like that much of the name table. Especially if you're scrolling, it needs to spend all the cycles it has to like render the next side of the screen to the right, wherever you're about to go. So what it does is it actually just remaps the existing tiles to like their next state of animation.
Okay.
So if you think of like the overworld in Mario 3, everything just like the cactuses like slide back and forth, and they're all on the same sort of timing cycle. That's because it's actually just pointing to totally different sprites and just switching left and right, sort of back and forth.
Okay, so I want to start to wrap things up because I try to keep this typically about as long as the commute someone has, but this might be for there and back today.
Yep.
Because I love having these technical conversations, and you're like one of the rare people who are super technical and can also talk and keep things interesting. So this has been awesome. So now we're kind of coming around the home front. I'm going to end this the same way I end every other show, and that is on the last episode. I had these folks from Tales of Games who made Shut Up and Jam Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden. Now working on 2.
How's that going for them, by the way? I should probably listen to that.
Oh god,
they're hilarious.
They don't take anything serious. Anytime kind of like somewhat serious question you try to get, and I'm not a serious person at all, they just kind of diverge and go into silliness. So that was a fun show.
I need to listen to that.
They are big Final Fantasy fans as well, which I guess you kind of have to be to spend 8 years working on a JRPG for the Super NES. But with that in mind, they had a question, and that is, what is your favorite Final Fantasy character?
My favorite Final Fantasy character. And did they leave this for me specifically, or is that like a general thing? Next guest.
Well, it's for the next guest.
Ah, the next guest.
Were you a fan of Final Fantasy VII? I've got to know.
Rented it. Didn't beat it. I don't think it had the last disc, or it was messed up or something.
Oh man.
It was my younger brother that was way more into those games than me, and
Yeah.
I like bought Kingdom Hearts and he got way ahead in the plot, and we shared a room back then, unfortunately, so ruined it for me. That's my like experience with JRPGs.
Yeah, seriously, if you find out what happens at the end of the first disc, you're like, no, this is ruined.
I don't know. I never really played them. I played 8 almost to completion. I've never beaten a Final Fantasy. Squall's boring. He sucks.
Yeah.
Everyone in that game was dumb, actually.
Yeah, 8 was not quite my thing either. I remember I bought it the day it came out,
$99.99.
Yeah, same day as the Dreamcast. I also got a Dreamcast, but I got Final Fantasy thinking like, oh my god, 7 was so good, 8's gonna be awesome, and I returned it 2 days later. It was just nothing like 7. And I wound up and played through it again like 2 years ago on the Vita, but just had the hardest time getting into it.
Yeah. I managed to stumble across, I don't know, like a friend gave me like a strategy guide for 8, like before it came out, or maybe like tips and tricks had in the magazine or something.
Yeah,
it was like this little booklet. And I like read the whole thing like 3 times. I just read the whole plot. It was so fascinating, but it just wasn't that much fun for me to play.
Yeah, a lot of grinding. If you don't like grinding, they're not your thing.
Final Fantasy characters.
That's okay. If you don't want to name one, I can skip that for somebody else.
Say Barrett, because Barrett just seems really cool.
Yes.
Likes visuals, the whole character design.
So trying to throw on the screen.
Waka. Change my mind.
I actually just went through that game.
Final
last
answer.
Summer. Yeah. Waka, Final Fantasy. Yeah, he's kind of all over the place. This guy. He is what do they call it? That ball game that you play.
Blitzball.
Yeah, Blitzball. That's it. So he's like the Blitzball champ. Range guy kind of sits in the back row and constantly throws that ball.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have your question from you just answered their question. So I don't know who's going to be on the show next. I haven't asked everybody yet, but I want to know, what is your question for the next developer who comes in the show?
Oh man, I should have realized this was coming. I should have
Come
started
on.
thinking about this.
It can be technical, non-technical, whatever you want.
I want to have something like funny or weird too. Least favorite game.
Okay.
Like absolute least favorite that they've played.
Okay. That you've played. I should put that in asterisk because a lot of people say, "Oh, this game's terrible." Like,
It's like,
E.T.
they'll say like E.T. or something. No.
Yeah.
Make
It's
a
like,
game
oh,
you beat.
you
They
have
have
an
to
Atari.
they have to
huh?
have beaten this game and hated it. That's what it is.
Yeah. It's like the people who are going through whatever that space game is now. I'm losing my mind.
Faster Than Light, maybe like the roguelike one.
No, the PS4 exclusive.
Oh god, you can't beat that game.
Right, it's like the people going through that now and saying like,
It's
"Oh,
for PC
I'm
too.
75
No
hours in
Man's
and I hate
Sky.
this game." Yeah, that's it.
People made that game in the 90s. I don't know why people are so excited about this time around.
Yeah,
I played that like on DOS, basically.
Yeah. Hey, to each their own, I say. To each their own.
Yep.
Okay. So I've got some awesome notes from this show. I'm going to put this thing together, bundle it up, throw it online very soon. But in the meantime, where can people find you? Where do you want to point them towards? Whether it's your Twitter handle,
my
Facebook?
Twitter's pretty good. I think that's like my public thing, which is AND0P, ANDOP.
So it's at AND
0P. Yep,
Okay.
like Andrew, but with a 0 after the D, and then a P.
Perfect.
My last name, Peterson.
Oh, right. AND0P. Easy enough.
Also, in the beginning of the show, you called me Adam for saying.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to re-record that or something on your own,
Well,
but
I will make a note of that myself.
yep, doesn't really matter to me, but people might
I don't know
notice.
why
Because then
I
you
said
called me
Adam.
Andrew probably 20 seconds later, so like.
Yeah, it's probably like, this guy can't read. It happens to the best of us.
And you see my Twitter icon is Shadowgate. I don't know if you recognize it.
Yep.
I came across that while I was researching, and I was like, oh, that's a cool little combination of iconic stuff from that game.
Yeah, the sprites are kind of like all over the place. It's like a corrupted scene.
Mm-hmm.
That is awesome. Yeah, this is cool. I absolutely love the stuff you're doing over here. Let's be in touch because I think there's a lot we can do as well. And I'd love to see what you're working on, the community, this kind of game just continue to grow in the future as well.
Yeah, and shout outs to Paul, your friend Paul DiCarlo there, because I mean he seems like an awesome dude, but he even got us in contact, and
Yep.
he took the Hololens part and he's running with it.
Yes, he in one night he got Bluetooth gamepad, so the
Yep.
Xbox One S controller working with your emulator inside the Hololens.
Yep. Yeah, and that makes him technically, because I never had a. Oh, hey, he's there. He's in the Twitch chat. I didn't have a Bluetooth keyboard, and even though I had this $3,000 device that cost more than my car strapped to my head, I didn't feel like buying one. So he's technically the first person to have ever truly played like an AR NES port. So
Awesome. Look at him like contributing back to the source at PJDE Carlo. Yes, this is cool. Love this community. Love what people are doing here. So he's in Twitch chat. And the next time, you folks can hop in this chat as well. There's actually been people here the whole time. I just haven't been going back and forth.
Yep.
I'm not a very good Twitch chatter while I'm recording and live streaming. Although I know some people play all kinds of crazy games and manage to Twitch and go back and forth. I don't know. I'm not good. So look for us. Again, this is Indie Dev Podcast. I am your host, David Voiles. And we have Andrew Peterson on. And we will see you on the next episode. Enjoy.
Have a good one.
Stop recording. I'm good. I'm going to hang up real quick, and I'll call you right back.
Hey, exporting audio now. Oh god, Audacity. I'm gonna need like the MP3 thing.
Yeah, you got to get the lame encoder.
I think I already have it.
Right, yeah, wouldn't it be nice if it was just kind of built in?
Yeah, it's free, I think, too.
Yep, but for some reason they can't include it with the Audacity project. I don't know. N3S. Andrew Peterson. Yeah, this was absolutely awesome. Thanks again for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a blast to do stuff like this. I mean, since I just got into software development like professionally, and it's sort of, I don't know, postal stuff. It's kind of like a, it's a bit drier, even though the people I work with are pretty cool. But it's like to talk about this stuff is really, really cool, and finally start reaching out.
Oh no, I bet it's got to be. It's a project of passion, right? Probably a little more interesting than what you're doing now.
Hmm. I'm excited for the desktop. I think because I added audio, I got file loading. It wasn't until a week ago that I wasn't hard